Good afternoon, BSides Columbus. My name is Brandon George. This talk is called Hunt Like You Mean It. Just a quick note about myself. Currently, I am a senior analyst at Binary Defense's SOC, and I am currently developing and maintaining two projects for threat hunting, one of which is curtailed to quick and easy deployments of the ELK Stack for threat hunting, and the other is a fork of Olaf Hartong's Sysmon modular project. So topics we're going to go over today. We're going to go over what targeted threat hunting is, why we do threat hunts, and how we do threat hunts. So I want to go over just the working definition we're going to use today. This is pretty much what you'll see across the board, but it is proactively searching for threats or signs of compromise within an environment. So let's go over targeted threat hunting. Targeted threat hunting was an idea that I found to be the most effective in getting small organizations and small deployments for threat hunting up and going. It is a risk-based approach to data retention. One of the many issues that I found in trying to talk about threat hunting was just the sheer volume of data people thought they needed to get started with threat hunting. Threat hunting doesn't need to be a massive deployment. It can start with a department, a few users, a few hosts, but you want to deploy it based on risk. So what I mean is you want to hunt for users that interact with the outside world a lot. Users like HR who are going to be receiving resumes, who are going to be interacting with people to get them started on their jobs. You want to talk to and hunt for accounting. They receive a lot of expense reports. They're going to be talking with vendors for costs. These are the types of users you're going to want to hunt for because we want to protect those users. We want to make sure that they can continue to do their job, and that if and ever the case that they do open a malicious document, it is not their fault. It is just them doing their job. We still continue to train them. We still continue to do everything we can for them. But if our defenses cannot withstand a maldoc, that speaks more lowly of us than it does of them. And so targeted threat hunting helps to aid in those defenses. Because if we just focus on our critical assets, we're going to catch it way late in the game. And so we want to be able to focus and start at the endpoint to catch it early, and hopefully see it before our EDR does. So let's talk about this a little bit more. It reduces the amount of logs we're going to ingest by sheer volume, but it's going to increase in diversity because we're going to take it from multiple different sources. It's easier to manage for small to medium organizations because you're focused on maybe specific departments comprised of only a few people, rather than large organizations, which you could do the same thing, but your departments are going to be larger, and you may not want to focus so much on premise as maybe you would consider doing so in a small to medium organization. It's really going to come down to whatever is going to be the most cost effective and easiest to manage. Because when it comes to this, you got to not only organize the operational side of it, but you got to be able to maintain and equip the hunters who are going to be in your platforms. So, why do we hunt? I think the definition itself gives a pretty good reason about why to hunt. You're proactively searching for threats and anomalies, and I want to kind of harp on anomalies because it is easier to hunt for anomalies than it is for threats. And so, with all of that in mind, it equips us to do a couple of other things as well. It allows us to get familiar with our environments and to notice anomalies as they happen or in a very short period of time. It equips us in such a way that when we do these deployments, we can get a feel for what is normal for these hosts, and when something deviates from that normal behavior, we can kind of catch it and investigate. The last and I think most important thing that threat hunting enables us to do, and why we ought to be doing it, is that we can detect what we're not detecting. We can write rules and searches that maybe our EDR or our SIEM are just not designed or equipped to do at this point in time. And once we notice that, we actually have evidence that something is happening, we can incorporate those detections into our SIEM, into our EDR platforms, and then go forward, not just to embetter your organization, but to also maybe make your vendor better. That way you both have something to benefit from whatever you're seeing and making use of those logs for. So let's talk about types of hunts. Tyler Hudak, not too long ago, recently wrote a blog for Trusted Sec talking about what types of threat hunts you're going to be doing. Typically, there's only going to be two. There's a targeted threat hunt, and there's going to be a general threat hunt. The targeted threat hunt is when you have ants in your house. There is maybe some kind of BEC, or you have ransomware, or really any type of malware or threat actor in your environment, and you can specifically narrow it down to at least one specific detail that you can hunt for. And if you say it's a threat actor, maybe it's you have Emotet in your environment, or God forbid you had TA505 in your environment, what's going to kind of follow, and you can threat hunt based on those details, based on previous reports, or what researchers are posting about. These kind of things are huntable. They're focused on one threat actor, one piece of malware, and you can go from there. A general threat hunt may be focused on one or two aspects that may be seen across multiple threat actors, or maybe in particular something that is of value to you from a pen test or from a previous compromise, that say, why didn't we detect this? So you can do a threat hunt and say, I want to see evidence of malicious PowerShell in my environment. Malicious being, I want to see encoded and compressed commands. I want to see use of encoded command as a switch in the command line. I want to see multiple network connections via PowerShell, things like that. Very general. They're not specific to any one threat actor or type of malware. So let's talk about how we hunt. It starts with knowing your resources. Before you ever develop a budget, see if you can recommission an old server. If you're a relatively small organization, this may not be something that you have available to you, but in a medium to large size organization, that just may be something you can save your budget with. See if it's high in RAM and high in storage, because these applications are mainly going to focus on those two. You want to make sure that you have enough network capacity to not create so much ingestion that this has become more of a problem than a solution. And when we talk about storage, see if you can set up and do the math to set up 3 to 6 months of log retention. That is not always feasible, and I'm aware of that. 3 to 6 months is like gold standard that a lot of people can't really aspire to. But if you can get 1 to 3 months, that is a great start, because 1 to 3 months of dedicated storage of just logs that from hosts that you are interested in can be enough to do great threat hunts, on a small but maybe valuable data set. See how many daily, what's the size of the daily logs you want to receive from these hosts a day, and kind of go from there. Because then you need to focus on your analysts. Are you going to be able to feed them a steady flow of resources to distinguish one from a false positive from a true positive? And what are they going to do with gray areas? What are they going to do with hosts with logs that they are, unsure about? Are they going to have the time and available resources to study and know what to hunt for? All of these things you need to kind of take in consideration, especially if you're working in a team environment and you are not just the lone security guy that we have developed a mythos around. So let's talk about logs. Know your log sources. Do you have departments or specific hosts that you are really interested in and want to always kind of keep an eye on? Maybe you want to keep an eye on your C-suite. You want to hunt for specific users. Identify those risky users, because they are going to be of value to you when you are doing your threat hunts. Keeping your assets in scope makes retention much easier, and it opens up other opportunities later to increase what types of logs you're going to be ingesting. Once you know what you're going to be ingesting, think about what is going to be most valuable to you. Is it, you're obviously going to have Windows operational logs, but are you going to deploy Sysmon? Are you going to deploy Zeek? Are you interested in Windows DNS logs? And this should go without saying, but you should be logging PowerShell. All of these things can, once put together, can offer you a very clear and valuable picture into what a successful hunt may look like. Can you, extrapolate, these what seemed like disparate details to form a clear picture. All right, let's talk about centralized logging. If you want a successful threat hunting program and you want to save an incident responder a lot of time, you must centralize your logging. Doing it now is much easier than how it used to be, even 5 to 7 years ago. Using shippers like NXLog and WinLogBeat are going to be the way you are going. I would say the easiest way to get your logs from your endpoints to your platform, whatever that may be. And I talked about this before, but make note of how much congestion this might create. If you have enough bandwidth internally, this shouldn't be too bad. However, if you are just getting all gung-ho about it, this might create some problems. So let's talk about full text searching platforms. The 3 that I am going to try and just talk about real quick are the 3 that I know of and have had experience with. Elasticsearch is remarkably efficient, and what Elastic is doing with their products now, I think, is quite remarkable. If you want to look at cloud storage, Humio is very effective, and I think it is a wonderful place to do basic searches and hold all of the logs that you're looking for. It's very similar in searching to things like Kibana, and you can pull all sorts of fields out with Humio. Splunk. Splunk has built quite the reputation in being just the place for log searching. You can do powerful metrics tracking with Splunk, valuable field data that you can pull out and search for, but it is always kind of come with that hefty price tag. So if it is not something you can do, Elasticsearch and Humio are 2 cost-effective measures you can do either in the cloud. Elastic Cloud is relatively inexpensive in comparison to Splunk, but still something you can deploy on-prem. Humio is also very cost-effective. I will say this though, if you have a SIEM or an EDR that has searching capabilities, do not go and try and search out a new product unless you are already considering, getting rid of whatever you had before. There are some very poor SIEMs that I have seen that have really lackluster searching capabilities, maybe due to lack of documentation or it's just too clunky. If that is something you want to do as a replacement, these 3 are ones I would encourage you to go look at. So let's talk about searching for anomalies. As a general rule, anomalies are easier to hunt for than threats. The reason being is that threats require that you know that they're threats. When you search for anomalies, you have the opportunity to see things that maybe aren't necessarily malicious, but they are suspicious. Maybe prompts something like, hey, we have a pretty severe misconfiguration with our SharePoint server, things like that. You can use metrics after you've pretty repetitiously set baselines to notice things that are kind of out of line. Because once you set baselines, you can start catching low-hanging fruit, like should winword.exe be spawning a child process. That's something you can see on an endpoint. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily see that on a server, but you can set up searches to say, hey, is there any process where the parent process is windward? You can set up things like that and have something pretty much instantaneously. Have you looked at MSHTA recently? If you don't know what MSHTA is, MSHTA stands for Microsoft Rich HTML Application. You can write what's called HTA files, and they're essentially just HTML pages with that you can use as a GUI. HP products are using them. Amazon Assistant is built with HTA files. Even TeamViewer, if you have the Chrome extension, that uses an HTA file as well. All of these things are false positives, but you can pretty easily identify, and we'll see this later, what a malicious use of MSHTA looks like. You want to talk about low-hanging fruit, let's talk about users launching and using applications they don't normally use. Should your HR rep be running PowerShell? Things like that can be useful to you to try and narrow down what is considered anomalous. I mean, maybe your HR rep is familiar with PowerShell and an application they use for employee management utilizes PowerShell. It may run as that user, but you can quickly identify when something is malicious and when it is not. So let's talk about knowing evil, because this is what threat hunting is all about. You have to be able to read up on blogs, read up on IR reports on what responders are seeing, as well as utilize things like malware reporting feeds, such as appany.run, URL House if you want fresh malware from researchers and what they're seeing, and you complement that with VirusTotal. You can get the useful sandboxing tools of AppAny as well as VirusTotal, and maybe gather sources from URL House. I'll touch on threat intelligence real quick. It can be useful, but is oftentimes less actionable than the sources I just mentioned before. I would also recommend studying open source signatures such as Sigma. There are a lot of threat hunters who use Sigma as the basis of just kind of documenting how they are going to form queries maybe in other platforms. If you have a Sigma rule that you wrote, you can use things like Uncoder to convert from Sigma to KQL for Kibana that we'll use later. I would also say look at using automated testing suites like Atomic Red Team. Other projects like LOLBAS and GTFO bins are other great sources. If you use Windows, Living Off the Land Binaries and Scripts, or LOLBAS is a great repository by Odd Varmo at TrustedSec that he has been building for years now. It is a wonderful repository that I pretty much used from the get-go to search for, to really understand what malicious uses of RegSVR32 look like, malicious uses of RunTLL32. All of these things you can find in that repository and more. And if you're using the Linux equivalent, GTFO bins, there is a plethora of resources you can use to hunt on Linux. Something I would pretty much equate in the threat intelligence realm is MITRE ATT&CK framework. It is useful if you're hunting for techniques, and if you're using something like Olaf Hartong's Sysmon modular configuration, that is all tagged with MITRE techniques, and you can search for that depending on how your logs are parsed. You can search by technique in all of your platforms. So then let's talk about knowing normal. Someone I want to bring your attention to and whose resources I've used to even help develop this talk is Samir over at Elastic. He, I think since I found him, has been talking about knowing normal, how to filter out and try and increase your detections and threat hunts by just filtering out and looking up startup processes in Windows. That's an easy thing you can do, and we'll get into that in a little bit later as well. But again, this idea of baselining is fundamental to threat hunting as much as it is searching, because if you are not able to filter out what is normal, you're going to have a very hard time making this program effective. So let's talk about building hunts. There are 3 ways to kind of categorize how you can build hunts. You can use automated testing platforms like Atomic Red Team, as well as build your own scripts and tests with Lolbass. But then you're going to have to eventually get to a point where you're going to have to call on a professional. So pen tests or any type of security tests might be something you look into. It's expensive, but it may be worthwhile. It's a better way to test your detections and know what artifacts are being left behind. If you can, get in communication with your pen tester and say, hey, we want to do an assumed breach on our HR department. We'll have either a Dropbox or we will set you up with an account on here, and you can kind of go from there. Again, it's a quick and dirty way to do it, and it'll often take a week, maybe 2 weeks at most, and something you can say, hey, we want to test our detections for our threat hunting team and go from there. Because a lot of the time you're going to have to do this for compliance anyway, so why not make use of it for your other teams? Now, the most expensive way to really build hunts is around red team exercises. I have heard in the past of red teamers getting caught by threat hunting teams because they're consistently looking for things that they know their EDR and SIEM platforms are simply just not catching, because correlation rules would be too complex, or maybe they don't have the kind of rapport with their EDR vendor to say, hey, we want to detect this, and maybe they're just not willing to do it at that point in time. So having a threat hunting team can help remediate both of these problems. So let's talk about what we should be searching. Let's talk about process creations, because it is the bread and butter of most threat hunts. If you are not going to deploy something like sysmon in your environment, enabling command line auditing with event ID 4688 is the first thing I would do. There's a lot you can collect without having to raise your events per second and say something like a SIEM. And if you want to use a SIEM for threat hunting, again, it's not going to raise your EPS, and you can start flagging things like suspicious process creations, suspicious service creations, things like that are going to be useful to you. Maybe not service creations for 4688, but at the very least, you can start filtering out known and trusted applications with event ID 4688. So let's talk about a simple persistence mechanism that's been used for years. That is run once registry keys. Malware to this date is still using this as a persistence mechanism for system reboots and user logons, and they can start their process. They can start their process as whoever, based on which registry hive it's attempting to be ran out of. Let's talk about PowerShell. It is quickly going out of style with our favorite red teamers or pen testers, because auditing, aside from maybe PowerShell version 2, is so much better than what it was when it first got started. So, however, again, commodity malware is still using it because it's just easier that way. Maybe they'll hope they'll get an easy win and they won't get caught. But you may not get so lucky with your local pen tester. Let's talk about scheduled tasks and bits. Bits is a really remarkable way for malware to call back, get updates, pull down new files in a way that maybe oftentimes people aren't even looking for it. So it's really useful to look for signs of URLs inside of bits jobs, as well as look for URLs in scheduled tasks. I'll show you a mechanism for privilege escalation utilized by scheduled tasks. So there's almost a 1-2 punch here with that, because you can use it as a persistence mechanism to maybe restart a job to, let's say, for a crypto miner. I've seen that in the past, not just for privilege escalation, but also for persistence. So let's also look for unusual calls to vault CLI.dll. If you are looking at event ID 7 for sysmon, that is an image load. You want to look for unusual images attempting to load vault CLI.dll. LSAS is going to call vault CLI.dll, but that's because that's what the local security service is going to do. If you look for any applications in, say, in app data roaming, that's something you can look into, especially if it's an untrusted application. So let's talk about group modifications real quick before we go back to path mismatching. If you have maybe an IAM person on your team who can help you keep track of what users are in what groups, maybe you can see users being added or removed from groups that maybe were never specified in your procedures. Things like that can be things you can hunt for. They're not always the most fun hunts, but they can be done. So I want to talk about path mismatching real quick. Very simple to understand. You can have a list of files that are in C Windows or in System32 that you can set negation statements to say, I want every instance of run DLL32 that is not in C Windows or in C Windows System32. Things like that are really easy wins as well, because that I can't even think of a good reason why that should happen, but if you see that, investigate it. So I want to talk about DLL search order hijacking. It's a similar idea to path mismatching, except for the fact that it is a untrusted DLL being called by a trusted executable. If a trusted process is attempting to load maybe some sort of DLL, it's going to look first in its current directory, and then its parent directory, and then in whatever is in its path next. So if it can set up the search order, if malware can set itself up in such a way where a trusted application can run its code, it's an easy win. So let's talk about Kerberos. There is a great blog by TrustedSec that goes over how to hunt for Kerberosing. If you're not familiar with Kerberosing, take time after this to go look it up. It's very involved, and I'm not even sure I fully understand it some days, but it is something that if you use Kerberos in your environment, it's very easy to look for and something you can investigate, because if you use Kerberos in your environment, you can't stop it. It's just how Kerberos works. Another one you can look for is unusual applications in app data. Again, the reason I try and harp on app data so much is that if malware does not have high enough privileges, maybe to drop itself in Windows temp, it's going to use app data roaming, app data local low. Then let's talk about high volume DNS queries. Something that was first taught to me when I was learning about threat hunting is high volume DNS TXT record requests. You can form whole scripts just by the records that you can get back from TXT records, because TXT records can hold more data than your usual, say, A or AA record. So you can use that to form PowerShell scripts or batch scripts, or even if you want to pull down all of the data from an executable, split into different parts, you can drop that on a host, execute it, and go from there. If you want to get into the deception realm and it's not going to break compliance, I would say preserve one or two old user accounts, maybe with some faux security groups that you can set up searches for to say, hey, if this ever hits off, we want to be alerted. We want to investigate immediately, because that is a sign of a honey account being used. And then let's talk about processes making unusual network connections. this is one of those things you can set up after you've baselined and set up metrics for. Say, hey, are there any processes across any of my hosts that are just hitting off more than usual? I'm going to show you that in a dashboard for filtering, and you can even curtail that towards searching for applications that shouldn't be making a lot of network connections, say like CMD or PowerShell. Again, depending on what is happening. So we'll go from there, and let's get started. What I'm going to show you is graphs for baselining and filtering, as well as just kind of setting up your own hunting dashboard for things that you can see at a glance. So searches we're going to do today. We're going to look at traces of Rdp tunneling, a couple examples of privilege escalation, as well as malicious use of MSHTA, malicious PowerShell, as well as reg SPR32. I'm not going to go over searching by matter tag, image, or host, just largely due to the fact that once you have already seen the examples I'm going to show you, you're going to be able to do these on your own. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you is an easy way to start filtering via search and then visualizing. So I'm going to go through this since I've already saved it. So I'm going to go to Discover. I'm going to open up a search. So the search I'm going to open up is processes making network connections. So here is what the search is comprised of. So I have an event code 3, so that is specifically for processes with network connections in Sysmon. And I am just going to, for the sake of the search, show process executable and event code. That way, in case we want to look at what the raw search data shows us, we can take a look. Now that I have only limited the events, or in this case, hits, of just events with event code 3, I can save that. So I'll save that as processes making network connections. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to go to visualize. So I have saved a visualization already, but we're going to go through it together. So I'm going to create a new visualization and a data table. And then I'm going to click processes making network connections. That way I can see there are 727 events where there are processes making network connections out of everything I've collected. So the first thing I'm going to do is split rows. So split rows, I want to click on terms, and then I'm going to look for that field that we looked at earlier, process executable. And then I want to set it for 5 just for this, and then I want to split the table, and I want to do columns. Actually, I'm going to do our rows. No, columns will be fine. And then I'll do terms again. And then I want to have the agent name. So that agent name is what is assigned by winlog beat and is kept whenever it hits Elasticsearch. So I'm going to update that. And here's what I have. You know what? I am going to keep it by rows. All right. So here's what we have. We have Sentry, which is one of my hosts, and then MS Edge Win 10. That's another one. So I know that it looks like Mattermost, Windows Defender, GitHub Desktop, and Service Host. It looks like Mattermost is the process that is making the most network connections on my host. It looks like on MS Edge Win 10, it's Service Host. So I could, start filtering out for Mattermost, Windows Defender, maybe Zoom, GitHub Desktop, GoToMeeting, and keep going that way. And so as you can see, there are a number of ways I can start filtering by this, and I could even do this at the search level. If I go back to Discover and go by this, so let's just say I'm looking for and not message that contains anything with Mattermost in the name. And it'll wipe everything out. So if I save that, and then I go back, clear out these errors, and then go back, visualize, and if I just get rid of all of these so that it doesn't clog up my screen, you'll notice that, Mattermost is nowhere to be seen. So you can save these for later, and I'm going to do that. Let's say hosts, process, making network connections. And then I will save that and keep it for later. It's just that simple. Okay, so we are in the main menu of Kibana, and we've set up our stack, we've ingested some logs, and now we want to do some hunting. So we go to Discover, and the first thing we're going to search is signs of Rdp Tumbling. Generally, you're going to look for signs of two things existing in the logs, one of which is signs that an SSH tunnel was created. Generally, we can see this with various executions of Plink, and we can also see this with RDP traffic communicating over the loopback address space. So if you want something to quickly search just to get, maybe not the most efficient query time, but you can look for 127.0.0.star and 3389. That way, as long as these two entities exist in logs, we can search for it. So we're going to search for the past 10 years, and it looks like we have a few hits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit command line in case we see an SSH tunnel being created, and it looks like we see Plink running. And let's go see the source IP, and then this is the destination IP. Yep, destination IP, as well as destination port and source port. So I'm going to move this over to be near the source IP. And so you can see an SSH tunnel being created, and it looks like there's going to be some sort of callback. And it looks like this could be a reverse connection to, let's see, 10.0.2.18. And there we have it. That's something easy you can search for. And if we wanted, we could also view the surrounding documents to see what around this time might help us figure out what might have caused the initial exploitation, because at this point, they're probably already setting in for the post-exploitation stage and trying to move laterally from pretty much there on out. Alright, so we'll go from there on to our next demo. We talked earlier about using scheduled tasks for persistence, but I also failed to mention that scheduled tasks can also be used for privilege escalation. That's what we're going to look at now. So I have a search that says show me any logs where the task name exists, and I set a field, I set a column to show me all the task names that we have in here. So we'll also look at the event ID as well. So I see I have a couple of 4698 events, 4702, and I'm really concerned with these 4698 events. So I have 4 events, so one of which is full powers task. I don't know anything about that. Let's look at update orchestrator. I know about that. These 3. Okay. Well, let's take a look here. So I have the subject user who created the task. Looks like it is local service. Let's take a look at what the content says. So I'm usually concerned about what it's executing. So I see exec. The command is referencing public users tools token manip. So I assume that's token manipulation, and then it's attempting to execute full powers.exe. Well, I don't know anything about that per se, so let's look at what else we have up here. So I'm going to look at the principals. It tells us the local service account, and I'm going to look at these required privileges real quick. So I see assign primary, token privilege, audit privilege, change notify, create global privilege, impersonate privilege, and working set privilege. So I have a feeling this is malicious, and I'm sure if I was able to get my hands on this executable, that might prove to do that. The reason I believe that is that local service accounts generally do not have high privileges. They have some privileges, but by design they are meant to be restricted. When you add these privileges, you start enabling them to do more. So if you can at least create a scheduled task as local service, maybe you can start a process that will require certain privileges to enable enable and elevate that user to do more than it was originally intended to do. So I know there's some privilege escalation going on here, but what about maybe some credential dumping? So I'm going to go over to a different index. I'm going to clear out, and I'm just going to start fresh. So I'm going to get rid of my task name, and I'm going to get rid of this because this is not in there. So what I'm going to look for is what we mentioned earlier. So let's talk about an image load to vault-cli.dll. So I see this. Maybe I'm looking for vault-cli.dll. Is there anything that exists in the logs? And there is. Let's take a look. What process was it? So credential dumping. So it looks like PowerShell attempted to load this. Now, oftentimes this is a bit more plentiful depending on what's happening on the host, but I want to see the process ID of this. So I'm going to go up here, I want to filter for that value, so we know that already exists, but I want to clear out the image load and just look for the process ID. And it looks like we have a couple of hits, and these appear to be, let's see what kind of event IDs these are. So I have an event code. Let's just go to the columns and see what we have. So I have a 1, 12, and a 7. So let's just start at the 1 and see what we got. Let's go to the command line, and I just like to see all of these at once. Well, it looks like, yeah, it looks like there was a download string from the PowerSploit repo to invoke Mimikatz and dump the creds. And I have a feeling this may be an image load that we looked for earlier. So let's see if we can look at what other images were loaded. So MPV client. Okay, here we go. So samlib. Okay, so that's for all the local creds, as well as vault-cli. Looks like smart cards, human interface devices, and the crypt.dll. All right, so we already know there's been activity of privilege escalation as well as credential dumping that may potentially be used for privilege escalation in the future, maybe for a user who has domain admin rights on this host. The last 3 examples we're going to look at is a combined use of malicious execution of PowerShell, regsvr32, and mshga.exe. So what I'm attempting to look for is maybe child processes of PowerShell. But first, I guess we better look at maybe just usage of mshga.exe. So let's look at message and mshga. Let's just see if it exists anywhere in our logs. And it looks like we have quite a few. So we have some process creations, 4688, and then we have some registry edits, 5158. Let's see if I can remind myself of what that one is. So it's a filtering platform. It looks like mshga made some sort of network connection. Okay, do we have any idea where? Not. So then, image load. Okay, so mshga attempts to use a crobj. Okay, that tells us a couple of things. Okay, so let's start looking at these command lines. Alright, so it doesn't look like there's too much available to us. Maybe that's not the field we need. Let's look at it. Alright, yep, that's just a different field we needed to use. Not so much better. Alright, so let's take a look. So we see CMD attempted to launch calc. There were a couple of HCA files put in the startup folder. Looks like an atomic test was ran. Alright, so this is probably the first thing we want to look at. So we look at mshga is attempting to launch just some raw JavaScript. attempted to reach out to GitHub user content, Red Canary, Atomic Red Team, T1059.001. So it looks like we attempted to download an SCT file, and then we see a couple other things, and then we see, yep, that process creation for MSHGA.exe, and then, yep, execute and close. There we go. We see PowerShell attempting to write host foreground color. Okay, I wonder if the parent process was MSHGA. Yep, parent process name MSHGA. So MSHGA was even launched in PowerShell. Back up here. Keep going. Yeah. I mean, we obviously see something has gone awry, and we see even MSHGA attempting to launch cmd.exe. Okay, so that's definitely one thing we can look at. So maybe we can start with the parent process, because I believe if we looked, it looks like the parent process was PowerShell. Now let's see if we can get the parent PID. Now I'm hoping it's a new process ID. Let's see if I can find process ID. Okay. So that's the command line. So let's see if we can filter for this. Nope, not that process. Oh, let's go find everything we need. Not that one, sorry. Down. That's going to throw all the fields I don't need. Parent process name. Okay. Well, it looks like we're just going to have to start here and start and look for that. And we'll just get rid of our query and start there. Now, I don't generally recommend doing this just because, you know, I'm running this in a test environment. If you have, you know, hundreds of hosts, this may take a while. But it looks like we already get a couple of hits. We have invoke Bloodhound. Yeah, that's remote download of Sharphound into memory, followed by an execution of the script. I would say that's definitely malicious. Keep going. We see there's power exploit attempting to be ran. There's that credential dump we looked at earlier. Invoke app path bypass. Okay. Now let's see if there's any. Because we said we combine this, and let's see if there's anything where regsvr32 is being executed. So message. Just start like that. And it looks like we have 3 hits. So we have, again, an Atomic Red Team test where it's attempting to call an SCT file that exists on the file system. And then we have, yeah, HTTPS attempting to call to a URL on GitHub, as well as attempting to launch CMD to launch regsvr32. Alright, so we see already that there is enough for us to work with to know that there is PowerShell is being utilized maliciously in the system, as well as MSHGA and regsvr32. Alright, so the last thing I want to show you is the dashboards that we can make from all the accumulated safe searches that we've done. So this is the hunting dashboard. So you can see we have malicious use of regsvr32. Let's see, we have suspicious use of MSHGA. We can see that log over here that we looked at earlier, as well as the use of any loopback addresses as well as port 3389. We see that in a command line as well. And just as a note, these are not all the same logs. This is just from a simple search that we saved. And anytime you see this being used in a log, you can investigate it pretty easily and see, okay, you know, what was imported, what was the image, And then we can also look at this complex search we built earlier, and you can look at the record of whatever's being used. You can also take a look at the raw data that we have from the PowerShell logs. Now to quickly move over, I'll show you the filtering dashboard. Now I built some of these searches in another time, but as you can see, I have host process and network connection. So this can be filtered to say, okay, maybe I want to add processes with network connections in my hunting dashboard, but maybe I can see, okay, I know that Windows Defender, I can ignore that. It hits 46 times, maybe not such a big deal, but then I can also see things like sysmon, attempt to make a network connection, as well as service host, and then SIH client. And then you can see the most popular command lines, which in this case is pretty clear. Out of all the hosts that I have reporting back, con hosts with that command line is the most popular, followed by none, so we can probably filter that out. And then MUS notification, some NVIDIA stuff, and then so on and so forth. And you can also filter by most popular events, so 4673, privilege requests, and then you can also see the most popular domains, and you can filter that out as well. Maybe you want to ignore github.com. Not exactly recommended because a lot of open source security tools are utilized at GitHub. So that is the dashboards you can create, so you can get all of the information that you are looking for at a glance, and you can start filtering from there. Alright, so some resources that I can provide and at least show you guys for future reading. Tyler Hudek at TrustedSec, he is the practice lead for incident response and does a lot of threat hunting as well. This blog was very useful. It came at a very good time to talk about what types of threat hunts you can do and what you might need. To talk about Samir's EVTX attack samples, the logs for privilege escalation, Rdp tunneling, reg SVR32, all of that was provided from his repository by his permission, and he has a lot of great slide decks and other repositories that he is updating. He's very busy and always working on something. The LOLBAS project and Atomic Red Team are two projects I would encourage everyone to go read and study on if you want to do threat hunting, or if you just want to try and grow your knowledge base for detection building. My Twitter is @thehacker4chan. I am always very busy on there. It's either feast or famine. I'm either tweeting a lot or I'm not tweeting at all. But I want to talk about the ELK project as well as my own project, ELK Hunt. ELK is a extremely versatile and very creative and very useful project for threat hunting on the ELK Stack. This project has been in development for quite a while, and it has grown from very early stages, and it has come a very long way. It incorporates things like playbooks. If you've ever heard of Mordor, Roberto and his brother are doing a lot of great work over there and are making a wonderful project. A shameless plug for ELK Hunt. It is and was inspired by the ELK project, but I wanted to try and strip down as much as I could, but still keep the bare bones of what makes ELK so useful, and that is the ELK Stack. That is shipping, and that is filtering, and trying to make use of visualizers, and trying to offer as many resources to people who want to get started with threat hunting in small environments, but maybe who don't have the resources or knowledge to incorporate something like ELK. ELK is turning into a combined detection and threat hunting platform that incorporates alerting. Mine does not. I try and stick to the philosophy of targeted threat hunting and all that it has to offer. If you want to contribute or take a look, please encourage.
highly encourage you to do so. It is at a stable build right now and is as simple as 2 PowerShell scripts. Please take a look. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, my name is Brandon George, and this is Hunt Like You Mean It.